The original idea of morality, or the leading conception of the supreme moral law, occurs by a necessity which seems peculiar to the subject, but which is by no means a logical one, both in that science, whose object it is to set forth the knowledge of what is moral, and also in real life, where it shows itself partly in the judgment passed by conscience on our own actions, partly in our moral estimation of the actions of others. Moreover, most of the chief conceptions in ethics, springing as they do out of that idea and inseparable from it, as for instance the conception of duty and the ascription of praise or blame, assert themselves with the same necessity and under the same conditions. In view of these facts, and because it appears highly desirable, considering the trend of philosophic investigation in our time, to submit this matter to further scrutiny, the Society desires that the following question be carefully considered and discussed. Is the fountain and basis of morals to be sought for in an idea of morality which lies directly in the consciousness or conscience, and in the analysis of the other leading ethical conceptions which arise from it, or is it to be found in some other source of knowledge? Part 1. Introduction. Chapter 1. The Problem. Why do philosophers differ so widely as to the first principles of morals, but agree respecting the conclusions and duties which they deduce from those principles? This is the question which was set as subject for a prize essay by the Royal Society of Holland at Haarlem 1810, and solved by J.C.F. Meister, and in comparison with the task before us, the inquiry presented no extraordinary difficulty, for 1. The present question of the Royal Society has to do with nothing less important than the objectively true basis of morals, and consequently of morality. It is an academy, be it observed, which invites this inquiry, and hence from its position it has no practical purpose in view. It asks for no discourse inculcating the exercise of uprightness and virtue, with arguments based on evidence, of which the plausibility is dwelt on and the sophistry evaded, as is done in popular manuals. Rather, as its aim is not practical but only theoretical, it desires nothing but the purely philosophical, that is, the objective, undisguised, and naked exposition of the ultimate basis of all good moral conduct, independent of every positive law, of every improved assumption, and hence free from all groundwork, whether metaphysical or mythical. This, however, is a problem whose bristling difficulties are attested by the circumstance that all philosophers in every age and land have blunted their wits on it, and still more by the fact that all gods, oriental and occidental, actually derive their existence therefrom. Should, therefore, this opportunity serve to solve it, assuredly the Royal Society will not have expended its money amiss. 2. Apart from this, a peculiar disadvantage will be found to attach to any theoretical examination of the basis of morals, because such an investigation is suspiciously like an attempt to undermine, and occasion the collapse of, the structure itself. The fact is, that in this matter we are apt to so closely associate practical aims with theory, that the well-meant zeal of the former is with difficulty restrained from ill-timed intervention. Nor is it within the power of everyone to clearly dissociate the purely theoretical search for objective truth, purged of all interest, even of that of morality as practiced, from a shameless attack on the heart's sacred convictions. Therefore he, who here puts his hand to the plough, must, for his encouragement, ever bear in mind that from the doings and affairs of the populace, from the turmoil and bustle of the marketplace, nothing is further removed than the quiet retreat and sanctuary of the academy, where no noise of the world may enter, and where the only God raised on a pedestal is truth, in solitary, naked sublimity. The conclusion from these two premises is that I must be allowed complete freedom of speech, as well as the right of questioning everything, and furthermore, that if I succeed in really contributing something, however small, to this subject, then that contribution will be of no little importance. But there are still other difficulties obstructing my path. The Royal Society asks for a short monograph setting forth the basis of ethics entirely by itself, which means to say, independent of its connection with the general system, that is, the actual metaphysics of any philosophy. Such a demand must not only render the accomplishment of the task more difficult, but necessarily make it imperfect. Long ago, Christian Wolff in his Philosophia Practica, Part 2, subsection 28, observed, Tenebrae in philosophia practica non dispelluntur nisi luce metaphysica fulgente. Translation: Darkness in practical philosophy is only dispersed when the light of metaphysics shines on it. And Kant, in the preface to his Grundlegung zur Metaphysik der Sitten, remarks, metaphysics must precede, and is in every case indispensable to, moral philosophy. For, just as every religion on earth, so far as it prescribes morality, does not leave the latter to rest on itself, but backs it by a body of dogmas, the chief end of which is precisely to be the prop of the moral sense, so with philosophy, the ethical basis, whatever it be, must itself attach to, and find its support in, one system of metaphysics or another, that is to say, in a presupposed explanation of the world and of existence in general. This is so, because the ultimate and true conclusion concerning the essential nature of the universe must necessarily be closely connected with that touching the ethical significance of human action, and because, in any case, that which is presented as the foundation of morality, if it is not to be merely an abstract formula, floating in the clouds and out of contact with the real world, must be some fact or other discoverable either in the objective cosmos or else in man's consciousness. But as such, it can itself be only a phenomenon, and consequently, like all other phenomena, it requires a further explanation, and this explanation is supplied by metaphysics. Philosophy, indeed, is such a connected whole that it is impossible to exhaustively discuss any one part without all the others being involved. Thus Plato says quite correctly, Sicis oni physin axios logu katanoi se oi dynaton eine anaphistolon physeos. Translation: Do you think, then, it is possible to understand at all adequately the nature of the soul, without at the same time understanding the nature of the whole, that is, the totality of things? The metaphysics of nature, the metaphysics of morals, and the metaphysics of the beautiful mutually presuppose each other, and only when taken as connected together do they complete the explanation of things as they really are, and of existence in general, so that whoever should exactly trace one of these three to its ultimate origin would be found to have necessarily brought the others into his solution of the problem, just as an absolutely clear and exhaustive understanding of any single thing in the world would imply a perfect comprehension of everything else. Now, if we were to start from a given system of metaphysics, which is assumed to be true, we should reach synthetically a basis of morals, and this basis, being so to say built up from below, would provide the resulting ethical structure with a sure foundation. But in the present case, since the terms of the question enforce the separation of ethics from all metaphysics, there remains nothing but the analytic method, which proceeds from facts either of external experience or of consciousness. It is true that thus the ultimate origin of the latter may be traced back to the human spirit, a source which then, however, must be taken as a fundamental fact, a primary phenomenon, underivable from anything else, with the result that the whole explanation remains simply a psychological one. At best, its connection with any general metaphysical standpoint can only be described as accessory. On the other hand, the fundamental datum, the primary phenomenon of ethics, so found in man's nature, could itself in its turn be accounted for and explained, if we might first treat of metaphysics, and then by the synthetic method deduce ethics from it. This would mean, however, nothing less than the construction of a complete system of philosophy, whereby the limits of the given question would be far exceeded. I am, therefore, compelled to answer it within the lines which its own isolated narrowness has laid down. And lastly, there is the following consideration. The basis on which it is here intended to place ethics will prove to be a very small one, and the consequence is that of the many lawful, approvable, and praiseworthy actions of mankind, only the minority will be found to spring from purely moral motives, while the majority will have to be attributed to other sources. This gives less satisfaction, has not such a specious glitter as, let us say, a categorical imperative, which always stands ready for commands, only that itself in its turn may command what ought to be done and what ought to be left undone.
Not to mention other foundations that are entirely material.
I can only, therefore, remind the reader of the saying in Ecclesiastes, quote, Better is an handful with quietness than both the hands full with travail and vexation of spirit." In all knowledge the genuine, proof-resisting, indestructible coefficient is never large. Just as in the earth's metallic strata 100 weight of stone hides but a few ounces of gold. But whether others will prefer, as I do, the assured to the bulky possession, the small quantity of gold which remains in the crucible to the big lump of matter that was brought along with it, or whether I shall rather be charged with having removed from ethics its basis, instead of providing one, in so far as I prove that the lawful and commendable actions of mankind often do not contain a particle of pure moral worth, and in most cases only a very little, resting as they do otherwise on motives, the sufficiency of which must ultimately be referred to the egoism of the doer. All this I must leave undecided, and I do so not without anxiety, nay, rather with resignation, because I have long since been of the same mind as Johann Georg von Zimmermann when he said, "Rest assured until your dying day that nothing in the world is so rare as a good judge." For all true and voluntary righteousness, for all loving kindness, for all nobleness, wherever these qualities may be found, my theory can only point to a very small foundation, whereas my opponents confidently construct broad bases for morals, which are made strong enough for every possible burden, and are at the same time thrust upon every doubter's conscience, accompanied with a threatening side-glance at his own morality. As contrasted with these, my own position is indeed in sore and sorry plight. It is like that of Cordelia before King Lear, with her weakly worded assurance of dutiful affection, compared with the effusive protestations of her more eloquent sisters, so that there seems to be need of a cordial that may be furnished by some maxim taken from intellectual hunting grounds, such as "Magna est vis veritatis et prevalebit." Translation: "Great is the strength of truth, and it will prevail." But to a man who has lived and labored even this fails to give much encouragement. Meanwhile I will for once make the venture with truth on my side, and what opposes me will at the same time oppose truth. Chapter 2: General Retrospect. For the people morality comes through, and is founded on, theology, as the express will of God. On the other hand, we see philosophers, with few exceptions, taking special pains to entirely exclude this kind of foundation. Indeed, so they may but avoid it, they prefer even to find a refuge in sophistry. Whence comes this antithesis? Assuredly, no more efficient basis for ethics can be imagined than the theological. For who would be so bold as to oppose the will of the Almighty and the Omniscient? Unquestionably no one, if only this will were proclaimed in an authentic official manner, if one may say so, whereby no possible room for doubt could be left. This, however, is precisely the condition which does not admit of being realized. It is rather the inverse process which is attempted. The law declared to be the will of God men try to accredit as such, by demonstrating its agreement with our own independent and hence natural moral views, and an appeal is consequently made to these as being more direct and certain. But this is not all. We perceive that an action performed solely through threat of punishment and promise of reward would be moral much more in appearance than in reality, since, after all, it would have its root in egoism, and in the last resort the scale would be turned by the greater or less amount of credulity evinced in each case. Now it was none other than Kant who destroyed the foundations of speculative theology, which up to his time were accounted unshakable. Speculative theology had hitherto sustained ethics, and in order to procure for the former an existence of some sort, if only an imaginary one, his wish was to proceed inversely, and make ethics sustain speculative theology. So that it is now more than ever impossible to think of basing ethics on theology, for no one knows any longer which of the two is to be the supporter and which the supported, and the consequence is a circulus vitiosus. It is precisely through the influence of Kant's philosophy, through the contemporaneous effect of the unparalleled progress made in all the natural sciences, with regard to which every past age in comparison with our own appears childish, and lastly through the knowledge of Sanskrit literature, and of those most ancient and widest spread faiths, Brahmanism and Buddhism, which, as far as time and space go, are the most important religion systems of mankind, and, as a matter of fact, are the original native religions of our own race, now well known to be of Asiatic descent, our race, to which in its new strange home they once more send a message across the centuries, it is because of all this, I say, that the fundamental philosophical convictions of learned Europe have in the course of the last 50 years undergone a revolution, which perhaps many only reluctantly admit, but which cannot be denied. The result of this change is that the old supports of ethics have been shown to be rotten, while the assurance remains that ethics itself can never collapse, whence the conviction arises that for it there must exist a groundwork different from any hitherto provided, and adaptable to the advanced views of the age. The need of such is making itself felt more and more, and in it we undoubtedly find the reason that has induced the Royal Society to make the present important question the subject of a prize essay. In every age much good morality has been preached, but the explanation of its raison d'être has always been encompassed with difficulties. On the whole we discern an endeavor to get at some objective truth, from which the ethical injunctions could be logically deduced, and it has been sought for both in the nature of things and in the nature of man, but in vain. The result was always the same. The will of each human unit was found to gravitate solely toward its own individual welfare, the idea of which in its entirety is designated by the term blissfulness (Glückseligkeit). And this striving after self-satisfaction leads mankind by a path very different to the one morality would fain point out. The endeavor was next made now to identify blissfulness with virtue, now to represent it as virtue's consequence and effect. Both attempts have always failed, and this for no want of sophistry. Then recourse was had to artificial formulas, purely objective and abstract, as well a posteriori as a priori, from which correct ethical conduct undoubtedly admitted of being deduced, but there was nothing found in man's nature to afford these a footing whereby they might have availed to guide the strivings of his volition, in face of its egoistic tendency. It appears to me superfluous to verify all this by describing and criticizing every hitherto existing foundation of morality, not only because I share Augustine's opinion, non est pro magno habendum quid homines sincerint, sed quae citere veritas. Translation: it is the truth about a thing, not men's opinions thereon, that is of importance. But also because it would be like glafkases Athenas komisen, that is, carrying coals to Newcastle. For previous attempts to give a foundation to ethics are sufficiently well known to the Royal Society, and the very question proposed shows that it is also convinced of their inadequateness. Any reader less well informed will find a careful, if not complete, presentment of the attempts hitherto made in Garve's Übersichte der vornehmsten Prinzipien der Sittenlehre, and again in Stadlin's Geschichte der Moralphilosophie. It is of course very disheartening to reflect that ethics, which so directly concerns life, has met with the same unhappy fate as the abstruse science of metaphysics, and that its first principle, though perpetually sought for ever since the time of Socrates, has still to be found. Moreover, we must remember that in ethics, much more than in any other science, what is essential is contained in its fundamental propositions. The deductions are so simple that they come of themselves, for all are capable of drawing a conclusion, but few of judging. And this is exactly the reason why lengthy textbooks and dissertations on morals are as superfluous as they are tedious. Meantime, if I may postulate an acquaintance with all the former foundations of ethics, my task will be lightened. Whoever observes how ancient as well as modern philosophers (the Church creed sufficed for the Middle Ages) have had recourse to the most diverse and extraordinary arguments in order to provide for the generally recognized requirements of morality a basis capable of proof, and how notwithstanding they admittedly failed, he will be able to measure the difficulty of the problem, and estimate my contribution accordingly. And he who has learned to know that none of the roads hitherto struck on lead to the goal, will be the more willing to tread with me a very different path from these, a path which up to now either has not been noticed, or else has been passed over with contempt, perhaps because it was the most natural one. As a matter of fact, my solution of the question will remind many of Columbus's egg. It is solely to the latest attempt at giving a basis to ethics, I mean the Kantian, that a critical examination will be devoted. I shall make it all the more exhaustive, partly because the great ethical reform of Kant gave to this science a foundation having a real superiority to previous ones, and partly because it still remains the last important pronouncement in this domain, for which reason it has obtained general acceptance up to the present day, and is universally taught, although differently garnished by certain changes in the demonstration and in the terminology. It is the ethical system of the last 60 years which must be removed ere we enter on another path. Furthermore, my criticism of the Kantian basis will give me occasion to examine and discuss most of the fundamental conceptions of ethics, and the outcome of this investigation I shall later on be able to postulate. Besides, inasmuch as opposites illustrate each other, it is exactly this course which will be the best preparation and guide, indeed the direct way, to my own position, which in its essential points is diametrically opposed to Kant's. It would therefore be a very perverse beginning to skip the following criticism, and turn at once to the positive part of my exposition, which then would remain only half intelligible. In any case, the time has assuredly arrived for once to cite ethics before the bar of a searching scrutiny. During more than half a century it has been lying comfortably on the restful cushion which Kant arranged for it, the cushion of the categorical imperative of practical reason. In our day this imperative is mostly introduced to us under a name which, being smoother and less ostentatious, has obtained more currency. It is called the moral law, and thus entitled, with a passing bow to reason and experience, it slips through unobserved into the house. Once inside, there is no end to its orders and commands, nor can it ever afterwards be brought to account. It was proper, indeed inevitable, that Kant, as the inventor of the thing, should remain satisfied with his creation, particularly as he shelved by its means errors still more glaring. But to be obliged to look on and see asses disporting themselves on the comfortable cushion which he prepared, and which since his time has been more and more trampled on and flattened out, this truly is hard. I allude to the daily hackney compilers, who, with the ready confidence born of stupidity, imagine that they have given a foundation to ethics if they do but appeal to that moral law which is alleged to be inherent in our reason, and then they complacently weave upon this such a confused and wide-reaching tissue of phrases that they succeed in rendering unintelligible the clearest and simplest relations of life, and all this without ever once seriously asking themselves whether in point of fact there really does exist such a moral law, as a convenient code of morality graven in our heads or hearts. Hence I admit the especial pleasure I feel in proceeding to remove from ethics its broad cushion of repose, and I unreservedly declare my intention of proving that Kant's practical reason and categorical imperative are completely unwarrantable, baseless, and fabricated assumptions, and I shall further show that Kant's whole system, like those of his predecessors, is in want of a solid foundation. Consequently, ethics will again be consigned to its former entirely helpless condition, there to remain until I come to demonstrate the true moral principle of human nature, a principle which is incontestably efficient and has its root in our very being. The latter, however, has no such broad basis to offer as the above-mentioned cushion, so that, doubtless, those who are accustomed to take things easily will not abandon their comfortable old seat before they are thoroughly aware how deeply the ground on which it stands is undermined.
End of section 1.